As a big fan of Nioh 2 and being more or less positive towards its DLCs, it might be odd that I didn't really enjoy Wolong's Battle of Zhongyuan DLC. After all, it follows the same format as all the previous DLCs from Nioh and Nioh 2. 2 or 3 new main missions, 3 new boss fights, a handful of new enemies, a new weapon, and some side missions. So what exactly went wrong? Well, the reason for why the DLC failed for me is because of the damage done by the vanilla game. Wolong's enemy variety might be the worst I've ever seen in a game of this size. It's always been an issue in the Nioh games as well, but there is a saving grace there. Your moveset. You're always learning more skills for your weapons as you progress, so fighting the same yokai in the tutorial mission versus the last mission is night and day difference. Getting a new weapon in a DLC is a huge deal, that's tons of new abilities to have fun with. Whereas in Wolong, having a new weapon doesn't really do much. You don't progress with your weapons, they stay the same aside from the stats. The combat is the same at the start of the game as it is by the end of it. That's the challenge of making a deflection-based game. You need your enemies to carry the whole thing. If they don't have interesting varied movesets, your game is gonna suck. And while the enemies themselves are fine in Wolong, there's just not enough of them. I was hoping that for the DLC we'd get as many new enemies as possible, so I wouldn't have to keep fighting those goddamn fucking tigers, mermaids and hedgehogs. But alas, we only get a few new enemies and they range from easy to easy but annoying and just annoying. And the whole exciting bit about a new expansion is going somewhere different, exploring a new area. As much as I don't like Nioh 1's DLCs, they did get that bit right. They are wildly different maps from what you had in the base game. Nioh 2 struggled a little bit more with coming up with new ideas, but they were plenty better than what we got in Battle of Zhongyuan. Here it's just 2 super short generic snow levels with no interesting landmarks, and another castle on fire level. At least that one has one little gimmick with the ballistas that enemies can use on you, or you on them, or on oil pots that explode and kill enemies nearby and can reveal secret paths. That's something at least. But really, I'm just so tired of the castle on fire aesthetic. It's in every single game they make, and I can't tell them apart anymore. The snow missions are even worse. First one is pretty much a straight path to a boss that takes 5 seconds to clear, and the other just feels AI generated. It seems like there's zero thought to enemy placements, and that snake mini-boss is absolute fucking AIDS! So in short, Nioh 2 DLCs are more of Nioh 2, but that's okay, because Nioh 2 is great. Wolong DLC is more of Wolong, but that's unfortunate, because Wolong is kind of a mid-game. If you disagree, I'm happy for you. But let's talk about the one thing I actually really want to talk about, the new bosses. The one thing I do really like in Wolong are the boss fights, and it's the only reason I got the DLC at all, to be honest. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Once again, I'm reminded of how bad the storytelling in this game is, with how unbelievably forced these fights are. He fights us because he thinks we're bandits.
Must be bandits as well.
Does this pork chop in full plate armor look like a fucking bandit? For the fight itself, I think they did him a disservice with the scaling. The recommended level for the mission is 79, where the last base game mission recommended level is 93. Usually they make these DLCs as endgame content, not mid-game. But then the next DLC mission goes up to level 93, and the one after that takes another big leap into level 100. So I don't know what the fuck they were thinking, to be honest. It doesn't help that the unknown hammer wielder lacks a proper phase 2. Instead of gaining new moves, he just activates a buff that makes him immune to staggers. Which honestly he should have just started out with, or had it activated much earlier. That being said, he does do a relatively good job at avoiding getting stun-locked. He's always trying to create distance and zaps all over the place. But once he has his buff active, that agility makes the fight a little frustrating sometimes. He does a super long combo, I deflect every hit, build up full spirit, get ready to unleash it in his face, and then he just zooms out of there and I miss completely. So maybe he should have slightly bigger punishable windows, have him buff at 70% health, have a real phase 2 at 40 or 50% health, and then we're solid. He has a good moveset that I only started to appreciate once I did the side mission where he's a lot better scaled. So I'd say he's like a C tier boss overall, maybe B tier in the side mission. Our next boss is a returning favorite of absolutely no one, General of Heaven. And it might just be the worst boss I've fought in a while. Thanks Team Ninja, I'm so glad I paid for this boss. He's been upgraded with an extended moveset, most of which makes it more annoying than fun. I think the most boring way to create a long combo is having the boss just do the same repeating motion back and forth a dozen times. And that's what they did here. And it mixes especially poorly with the gimmick of the fight, General of Heaven summons. That's right, they've turned this into a gank boss. But for some reason they decided that instead of following the blueprint of Chinese Ornstein and Smo, they should just do Zhang Rang again, where it's total chaos. You can prevent him from summoning if you manage to do enough damage to this flying piece of parchment or whatever, but it's entirely up to the boss's AI if he lets you. He could just do his super long staff combo and you're screwed. So what's so bad about having multiple targets in this particular fight? The camera would be number one, I think. Not only is targeting the summoning parchment extremely wonky, but the extra bosses that are summoned are the worst possible candidates for a gank squad. They jump and teleport all over the place, and there's no way in hell you're gonna be able to keep an eye on them and the boss at the same time. It's almost like these three bosses were designed as solo fights. Oh yeah, they were! The only slight bit of mercy you get is that the summons disappear after a while, so if you just play it super defensively and run away, you might survive. Again, it's up to the boss's AI rather than your skill as a player. Fantastic job, Team Ninja, you really outdid yourselves this time. This boss is absolute trash, it gets a solid F tier. And finally we have Dian Wei, aka the only reason to get this DLC. One thing Team Ninja has never slacked on is cool demon designs, and this one is no exception. He's a giant bird-like monster with a gorilla body, reptile arms, hooves, and a flower tail that acts as his primary weapon. He can shoot lightning out of it, use it as a vacuum cleaner to suck you closer so he can do either a grab or a longer combo, which is a neat trick. He also incorporates it into his melee attacks with a tail swipe by spinning around, making for some really fun combos to deflect, both on the ground and in midair. What strikes me the most about this boss though is how he eases you into the later stages of it. When you fling his flower tail lightning back at him, he'll throw it right back at you once, and if you counter it again, it will knock him down. But later on in the fight, he'll play tennis longer and toss it back at you multiple times before falling down. The quick spin move he always does after recovering from getting a taste of his own medicine also gets a bigger role throughout, as it becomes a potential follow-up to his jump attacks. But it doesn't feel bullshit because you know the timing by now. His arm swipe combo also evolves with the fight. First he'll only do one swipe per arm, and then tail, followed up by this odd motion with both his hands that will come into play later. Then he can do the same move, but use each arm twice. However, in phase 2 he'll materialize 2 cleavers, and now whenever he finishes up this combo, the strange arm motion becomes a finishing move. But again, it doesn't feel bullshit because you know the animation already. He doesn't become harder by getting a bunch of new moves, but by recontextualizing things he already had. It didn't feel like he was trying to pull out a bullshit maneuver in phase 2 to end the fight, and rather he was teaching me the full fight in phase 1, like it was practice. And it was much needed because it was a nightmare chaos at first. I was just desperately spamming the deflect button hoping I would by chance parry something. But by the time I was ready to finish the fight, it had become very clean and methodical. So I believe Dian Wei to be a solid A tier boss. Not quite as good as Lu Bu for me personally, probably beneath 1 or 2 others, but still one of Wolong's finest bosses. As a story though, this was laughable. Was I supposed to feel sad this guy died? I just met him! I know these are massively important historical figures, but there's so much story to tell that Team Ninja clearly doesn't know how to wield it. Just make a full-on fantasy game, guys. You don't know what you're doing. Anyway, that's it for the DLC more or less. There were some forgettable side missions with very forgettable bosses. They're not worth talking about. You just spam them to death in a corner and that's all. But if you want one great boss, one abysmal boss, and one decent boss, I guess buy the DLC. There's nothing else to this DLC, really. Anyway, I probably won't make another video on the second DLC, but maybe for the third one, just to round it all up. Until then, so long, wo long.